Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. We had 3 briefings last week discussing the results of the November 3rd elections. I hope you were able to join us for those, or at least register for them so you could watch them on your schedule. We had quite a few results to talk about last week, even in states that changed their election procedures as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. But today we're more than a week out from the election, and there's even more results that we know and can talk about. And here to help me do that is Cory Eucalitto, who's managing editor of the Marquee team here at Ballotpedia. He was also with us on the webinar last Wednesday. So Cory, thanks so much for joining us today. And I think I can safely say we won't be making this a weekly thing.
Hopefully this is our last one. No, not really, but I expect it will be.
Well,
on this topic.
Yeah, pursuant to that point, we can probably start off with a discussion of where we are with regard to races and the numbers that are called versus uncalled. So can you give us a little bit of information on the overall landscape?
Yeah, so just within our entire coverage scope, 86% of all the races that we're tracking have been called. That's 8,437 called races and undisputed. On the other hand, 1,308 races remain uncalled, about 13%. So we're making really good progress towards being able to call a clear majority of all of the elections that Ballotpedia is following.
And of course, that includes elections, obviously at the presidential level, for Congress, state level races, state legislative races, and all the way down to local and school board races that fall within our coverage scope. So the big story right now is the presidential race, and we could probably spend a few minutes talking about where that stands currently. So Cory, can you kind of say where we are at this point?
Yeah, so for all of our top ballot races, we're relying on a consensus call from 5 news outlets: ABC, CNN, Fox News, NBC News, and the New York Times. I think it was Saturday when all 5 of those outlets came into agreement that former Vice President Joe Biden was the projected winner. He's won at least 279 electoral votes, according to the consensus from those outlets, over the threshold of 270 to win the presidency. President Trump has won at least 214. If that holds, President Trump would become the first president since George H.W. Bush in 1992 to lose his re-election campaign.
So how many states in total are we waiting for a winner to be projected?
So 3 battlegrounds, and I think we're actually also waiting on Alaska because they've just been slow in counting their votes, getting a lot of mail-in votes from across the state. But it's expected that President Trump will win Alaska. So 3 battleground states are Arizona, where there are a small number of provisional and other ballots remaining to be processed. With 98% of the votes counted, Biden leads Trump by 14,746 votes. Georgia, where with more than 98% of the votes counted, Biden is leading Trump by 12,567 votes. But the Secretary of State announced just today that there will be a full hand count. There will be a hand count audit of the state's election results. And the target date for completing that is November 20th, which is the state's certification deadline. So that's where it stands now, but there will be at least some ballots recounted there. And in North Carolina, where mail ballots postmarked by Election Day, November 3rd, can be accepted until tomorrow, November 12th, President Trump is leading by 1.4 percentage points with about 98% of the votes counted.
And what has changed since the last time we talked about this, ironically, about a week ago?
Yeah, over the weekend, Biden became the projected winner of Nevada. With 97% of votes counted, he's leading Trump by about 2.7 percentage points. And Biden became the projected winner in Pennsylvania, where there's been a lot of lawsuit activity, but with 98% of the votes counted, Biden is leading Trump by 47,215 votes.
All right, you mentioned those close races and the possibility that certain outcomes will be contested. Now, Cory, in any election year, this happens. There are close races, there are disputed outcomes, And obviously, this was a close election in quite a few jurisdictions. Now, the time frames for doing any kind of subsequent action vary from state to state, but I know we're doing a lot of tracking of this. So what can you tell us about, say, for example, recounts?
Yeah, so through today, we've tracked 21 recounts, either proposed, initiated, started, or completed. So a proposed recount is when a candidate or an election official has gone on the record saying that they will request to initiate one. An initiated recount is one that's formally begun, and then a completed recount, obviously, is one that's formally ended. So we've tracked 18 initiated recounts and 2 completed. 16 of those initiated and completed recounts are in New Hampshire, where mostly on state legislative races. I think 15 of those 16 were in just New Hampshire State Senate and State House races. There have also been initiated recounts in Florida, Iowa, and South Carolina, not at the presidential level, I should say. We've tracked 2 presidential recounts. One is a proposed recount in Wisconsin, which the Trump campaign says they're going to request. And the other is what I just mentioned, the hand count audit taking place in Georgia. The Trump campaign had requested it yesterday or the day before, and just this morning, the Secretary of State there said they would go forward with this hand count audit. We're also tracking lawsuits. We've tracked 25 post-election lawsuits across all of the elections. So again, not all at the presidential level, in 5 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. 15 of them, though, directly involve the presidential election and have all been filed by the Trump campaign. 9 of those 15 have been filed in Pennsylvania, 2 each in Michigan and Nevada, and then 1 each in Arizona and Georgia. None yet have resulted in the invalidation of any ballots, but we'll keep watching to see what happens in those lawsuits and any new ones that are filed.
All right, that's a great summary of where we stand in respect to recounts, lawsuits, and I imagine those numbers will change, go up and down over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks as states approach their certification deadlines, go past their certification deadlines, as that is usually a component of when that type of activity either needs to begin or end. Now, one element of the presidential race that we've been following here at Ballotpedia since 2016 is pivot counties. Pivot counties are those counties that were identified by Ballotpedia that voted for President Obama in 2008 and 2012, and then voted for or were carried by Donald Trump in 2016. So I know results have been certified in only about 7 or 8 states, but have we seen anything related to these kind of results at the county level? Can we draw any conclusions from what we're seeing in the data, Cory?
Yeah, before I get into that, we got one comment about the sound. Am I coming? It might have been on my end. Am I coming through a little bit louder now, Dave?
Yeah, you are.
All right, great. Hope that helps. Yeah, so the pivot counties. Pivot counties are the 206 counties that voted for President Obama, or Senator Obama, and then Trump in 2016. So we've been following what happens in those 206 pivot counties to see what might be the source of the outcome in the overall race. So we're tracking retained pivot counties and then carousel pivot counties, we're calling them. These numbers are all subject to change. Some of them are kind of like, the outcomes are sort of on the margin. So once results are certified, these might not hold. But the retained pivot counties, so these are now the counties that have gone Obama, Trump. So they were retained by President Trump. 174 of the 206 pivot counties were retained by President Trump. Those are across 30 states, and his average margin of victory there was 15 percentage points. The largest number of those retained pivot counties were in Iowa, where President Trump held all 31 counties that he flipped to become pivot counties in the first place in 2016. So those 31 pivot counties were the largest number of overall pivot counties in one state, in Iowa. After 2016, President Trump retained all 31, so that's the largest chunk of the retained pivot counties. Now, what we're calling carousel pivot counties went back to a Democrat, to Biden in this case. So they went Obama, Trump, Biden. There are 20 carousel pivot counties in 14 states, where the average margin of victory in those counties is 3 percentage points for Biden. The largest number of those are in Minnesota, where Biden flipped 4 of the state's 19 pivot counties to turn them back into what we're now calling carousel pivot counties. So President Trump retained 174 pivot counties. Former Vice President Biden flipped 20 of them.
All right. So, and I know, as you said, these numbers are changing, and we'll have a lot more extensive analysis, but quick math in my head shows that of the 206 pivot counties, President Trump retained about 85%, between 85 and 90% of those, whereas Vice President Biden, won maybe a little around 10%, a little over 10% of those. So that'll be fascinating information that we're definitely staying on top of, and we'll have further crunching of those numbers as more and more of these results get finalized. But now that we have another year's worth of presidential election data, there's some new counties that we can identify also, correct?
Yeah, this is a really interesting stuff. So now we can look at the Democrat, Republican counties. So the ones that went Obama, Clinton, and now flipped back to President Trump. There were 18 of those in 7 states, and Texas had the most of them with 7 counties. One really interesting one is Zapata County, I guess that's how you say it, which had voted for the Democratic candidate in every presidential election since 1920, but now looks like it's going to be won by President Trump. So that's a really long streak there, busted. And then on the flip side are the Republican, Democrat counties. So that would be McCain, Romney, Trump, Biden counties. There were 18 of those in 11 states, including 5 counties that had previously voted for the Republican presidential candidate in every election since 1960. Maricopa County, Arizona, Seminole County, Florida, Johnson County, Kansas, Riley County, Kansas, and Chesterfield County in Virginia. In 2016, we also identified 6 reverse pivot counties, those that went McCain, Romney, and then back to Hillary Clinton, the Democrat. Biden retained all 6 of those. But I think those long streaks of Democrat, Republican, or Republican, Democrat counties are really interesting.
Yeah, it is. All this data is super interesting, and what is really, really neat is we have so much history that isn't really affected by redistricting. The difference in doing this by, say, House district or even state legislative district is that those boundaries change as redistricting occurs, after 2000, after 2010. We don't have to worry about that with counties because those boundaries generally don't change. That's a really great breakdown, and like I said, there's going to be more information and more analyses of these in the weeks and months ahead. But this is some really cool data. And thank you for that breakdown about where we are with regard to recounts and lawsuits and other disputed outcomes for all elections. Now that we've talked quite a bit about the presidential race, let's look at the battle for control of Congress and specifically the United States Senate. So where do things stand on that race at this point?
Yeah, so according to our race calling standards, and actually most in this case, control of the Senate hasn't been determined, and we might not know which party holds a majority until January. We have called, again, looking for that 5-outlet consensus, 31 of the 35 races that took place. Right now, Democrats had a net gain of 1 seat. They flipped 2 seats, one in Colorado, one in Arizona, while Republicans flipped a seat in Alabama. And so that leaves 4 undecided races. Republicans lead Alaska, and I think there's just 1 outlet as of an hour ago or less that hadn't called the race in Alaska for Republicans. Republicans also lead in North Carolina. Again, I also think there's just 1 outlet that hasn't called the race for incumbent Republican Tom Tillis in North Carolina. So it looks like those 2 might be going Republican. But then it also looks like the special election and the regular Senate election in Georgia are headed to runoffs. Those would take place on January 5th because no candidate got more than 50% of the vote in those races. So if Republicans hold North Carolina and Alaska, and both Georgia races go to runoffs, those runoffs would determine which party controls the Senate. Best case scenario for Republicans is they win both of those Georgia runoffs and end up with a 52-48 majority. Best case scenario for Democrats would be they win both of those runoffs. The Senate is split 50-50, and then there would be a tiebreaker. They'd have an effective majority because the tiebreaker would be the president of the Senate, projected Vice President Kamala Harris. Those counts above include 2 independent senators, by the way, who caucus with Democrats among the Democratic seats. So the way it's looking, although it's not certain, because there is that audit recount in Georgia as well. So we're not calling those Georgia races for runoffs just yet. But if the chips fall as it looks like they will, those 2 Georgia races will be wild.
Yeah, as you say, control of the Senate looks like it'll be dependent on Georgia. And Ballotpedia is starting a new newsletter next week covering one or both of those runoffs, as it appears that we'll have something conclusive by then. And we're also going to, if you have any suggestions for a good name for that, different pun or play on words that you can, it would be a good title for that Georgia newsletter. Send them to us at editor@ballotpedia.org. But I joked or remarked on a previous webinar that I think the television stations, radio stations, newspapers, and whatnot in Georgia are maybe pretty happy if they get all of the attention of the control of the United States Senate. Let's shift our attention now over to the other chamber of Congress, and that's the House of Representatives. Cory, where does that stand?
Yeah, so according to our race calling policy, same one, we've called 417 of the 435 races. Democrats have won 216. Republicans have won 201. So Democrats are two seats shy, according to just how we've called the races, of maintaining their majority. I think it's safe to say they're expected to do so. Quite a few outlets have projected that. 12 seats have changed party hands so far. Republicans gained 9, 8 from Democrats and 1 from Libertarian Justin Amash, who didn't run for re-election. Democrats gained 3, 1 in Georgia and 2 in North Carolina. The Democratic pickups were all in open seat races. And the Republican incumbents in North Carolina's 2nd and 6th districts did not run for re-election after court-ordered redistricting changes. So those other ones were all Republican flips from Democratic seats. Right now, going into the election, there's a 232 to 197 majority for the Democrats in the House. So they would see their majority reduced going into January.
All right, and that leaves about 18 uncalled races for the U.S. House. I know some of them are pretty close, so the final breakdown may not be known for several weeks. I saw a report last night that indicated that there was at least 6 or 7 of them where the margins were really, really small. Anywhere from 1,000 votes to less than 50. So those numbers won't be finalized, I think, for a little while. All right, that's a great summary of where things stand in the battle for control of Congress, and obviously talking about Georgia and how it'll be interesting over the next 8 weeks. Let's now move over to state level government. And there were 11 gubernatorial races this year, not as many as during a midterm, where there's usually 37 or 38. But there were 44 states that held elections for one or both chambers of their state legislature, which means trifecta control of government was at stake in 44 states. So what can you say about trifecta control of state government stands at this point, Cory?
Yeah, there's been a surprisingly, I guess, small amount of change on this front. So going into the elections, there were 36 trifectas, which was the most since 2013. 21 Republican trifectas, 15 Democratic trifectas. 11 states held elections for governors, 44 held elections for one or both chambers. And across all those states, 2 trifectas have changed, or 2 states have changed trifecta control, rather, flipping from divided government to Republican trifectas. So there'll be on that 2 more Republican trifectas, it looks like. Republicans won the governorship in Montana. We were able to call that, I think, pretty early last week. And Republicans, it appears, have flipped the New Hampshire State House and the State Senate. So in Montana, there was a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. There's now all 3 controlled by Republicans. In New Hampshire, there was a Republican governor and Democratic control of both chambers of the legislature. now it looks like Republicans will have control of all three branches there too. We're still waiting on calls, though, in the Arizona and Alaska House of Representatives. And Alaska has this weird power sharing agreement where there's actually a going into the election, elected Republican majority, but a subset of Republicans decided to caucus with the Democrats. So the state was under divided government, but the outcome there could result in possibly a Republican trifecta, but race calling is a little bit slow there. So if Republicans hold their net gain of 2 trifectas, they'll have 23, Democrats with 15, and 12 divided governments.
And I do remember we covered the goings-on or the power struggle or power changes related to the Alaska State House for quite a while after the 2018 election. So there's definitely some unique things to follow there. All right, so now that we have a sense as to how much or how little change there is in trifecta status, you've mentioned there's 2 legislative chambers that flipped. Can we break down how things stand with regard to the specific numbers of state legislative seats that were won for both parties? And I understand that these races may not have a lot of total votes in some places. Some of these districts can be relatively small. And that increases the chances of them either not being called yet or having some sort of really close margin that prevents media outlets from definitely saying who won.
Yeah, so overall, it's looking likely that this will be the fewest number of flipped state legislative chambers in an even year election, so in any election, any given election year since 1944. So kind of like trifecta, just not a lot of overall change. Going into the election, Republicans were the majority in 59 chambers, Democrats were the majority in 39, and then there was the Alaska House with the power sharing agreement. It appears now Republicans have flipped 2 chambers, which I mentioned when we were talking about trifectas, New Hampshire State Senate and the New Hampshire House. 2 chambers remain too close to call, again, Alaska House and Arizona House. But even if the Alaska House and the Arizona House flip, we'll still have the fewest flipped state legislative chambers since 1944, which is an interesting kind of piece of history. Across all the state legislative seats, Republicans have won 2,372 state House seats. Democrats have won 1,975. 490 are too close to call. 290 of those are for Democrats, were held by Democrats before the election, and 200 held by Republicans. So 2,372 Republican state House seats, 1,975 Democratic state House seats so far. In state Senates, Republicans appear to have won 577 state Senate seats, Democrats 467. That leaves 94 races too close to call, 52 that were held by Republicans before the election, and 42 that were held by Democrats. So the big takeaway, though, on state legislative seats and state legislative chambers is that what I've said before, just a very few number of flipped state legislative chambers, the fewest since 1944.
Yeah, that's been the theme that all of us have been talking about for about a week. And those broad numbers are interesting, but they're kind of tough to put into context, obviously, because we don't know exactly what percentage of seats were up. That is to say, in some chambers, especially in the state senates, only maybe half or a certain number of seats are up every 2 years. So you might have had a situation where you had a lot of seats that were up for one party or the other. So I think once we get a little bit more data and we get more, fuller results, we'll have a better breakdown of that. But that's, kind of the caveat I need to add to those numbers. Now, one area that we can discuss today that I think is really fascinating are state Supreme Court elections. They took place in 29 states last week. And usually, unlike state legislatures, this is not for the entire body. Usually there is a certain number of judgeships that are up in any given cycle. And some of these can be retention elections, some of them are partisan elections, and some of them are nonpartisan elections. So you kind of, again, have to sort of look at this on a state-by-state basis, but there is kind of some major races that we've been watching. So do you have any kind of overall summary or any specific results for these?
Yeah, so in those 29 states that held judicial elections on November 3rd, 69 seats were up for either election or retention election. 40 were up for regular election, 29 for retention election. Of those 69 seats, right now, 7 new justices have won election to the courts of last resort in their states. We're waiting on 2 seats in North Carolina to see what happens. 1 new justice in North Carolina leads an incumbent, but again, mail-in ballots can be accepted through tomorrow as long as they were postmarked by November 3rd. And there's so basically 2 seats in North Carolina we're unsure of right now. So there'll be 7 new justices elected to state Supreme Courts on November 3rd. 1 justice lost a retention election. That was Justice Thomas Kilbride, a Democrat from Illinois. And it's actually the first time in Illinois history that a justice has lost a retention election. And then Michigan was the only state which court control changed as a result of the election. Before the election, the court was composed of 4 justices who, there's this system where justice goes through a partisan primary or convention and then wins a general election. So 4 of the justices had gone through Republican conventions, so we can say they're Republicans. So what happened is one of the Republican justices, Stephen Markman, hit the mandatory retirement age of 70 and had to retire. A Democratic new justice, Elizabeth Welch, won the seat that had previously been held by Markman, so we can count that as like a flipped seat. And overall, the court balance in Michigan will be composed of 4 justices who advanced from Democratic conventions and 3 who advanced from Republican conventions. So control of the state Supreme Court will have flipped there. Also, some interesting results in Louisiana, where there were primaries, because Louisiana uses a majority vote system, which means that all candidates have to compete in a November primary, but they can only win the election if they win more than 50% of the vote. 1 justice, Jay McCollum, received 56% of the vote, winning the District 4 seat. But there will be a runoff in District 7, or there was supposed to be a runoff in District 7. Piper Griffin and Terry Love received, neither of them received more than 50% of the vote in District 7. Terry Love conceded the election to Piper Griffin, so she won't compete in the general election. Both were Democrats there.
So there'll be new justices on the Supreme Court in Louisiana, but the partisan composition doesn't appear to have changed. And again, we'll have more information about this. As you indicated, the North Carolina results won't be, ballots will still be received through tomorrow, and there's obviously more counting and verification that'll happen there. So again, stay tuned to Ballotpedia, and we'll have more information as those results start to come into focus. So this has been a fantastic wrap up, 1 week out of everything that we know at this point. So thank you so much for all this information, Cory.
Yeah, thanks. Hope it was helpful.
Okay, as we've mentioned throughout this briefing, ballot counting and processing is still ongoing, and there's still results to be determined. We've made reference to that a bunch of times. And we're going to continue to analyze all of this. You can find the results of all those analyses on our site. And we'll also be highlighting most of the significant analyses that we do in our daily news summary, which is the brew. We plan on looking things like margin of victory, close elections, and so forth. So if you love reviewing all of that information after the election is over, you're definitely going to want to subscribe to the Daily Brew. And of course, don't forget to check in regularly on our homepage, which highlights all of the day's political news and important stories, including the upcoming elections, such as the ones that are potentially happening for the U.S. Senate in Georgia. And we also have all of our regular menu of newsletters on a host of subjects, from the federal courts to public sector unions to election policy, as well as our weekly news recap, The Tap. So there's a link on our homepage to our full listing of newsletters. You can click on that and receive samples or subscribe to whichever ones you like. So thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.